Thou wast transfigured on the mount, O Christ our God, revealing thy glory to thy disciples as far as they could bear it. Let thine everlasting light shine upon us sinners, through the prayers of the Theotokos, O giver of light, glory to thee.
Hi there, good evening. Welcome back to another Bible study here at the Transfiguration of Our Savior Greek Orthodox Church in Florence, South Carolina, in cooperation with the Orthodox Christian Network. We welcome you this evening. This is session 17 on our series on the book of Acts, the Church of the Holy Apostles. And we're using as our guide St John Chrysostom, his homilies on the book of Acts. So welcome. If you have not yet had an opportunity to download the study guide, you can find the study guide at myocn.net at the Orthodox Christian Network, where you can download that and have it ready for you during tonight's session. If you want to get everything ready, we'll be studying in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 6 through 34, and in homily 16 from St John Chrysostom. And if you have the printed edition, we will specifically be reading from beginning page 103 in homily 16. So this is session 17. This is our 17th week together. And I'm going to ask everyone around the table, if you remember, now this is true confessions time, way back to session number 1. Now, Janelle, you weren't here for session number 1, but I had encouraged all of you, if you remember way back when. What did I encourage you to do in terms of the book of Acts? Do you remember what it was?
Yes,
read the whole thing once a week. Remember that? I suppose I should settle with simply one time all the way through, but how's that going, your reading? Because I want to remind everyone of that challenge, and everyone who's watching on the internet too. In Orthodoxy, the scriptures have to become part of us. And so if you remember the discussion we had 17 weeks ago now, actually more than 17 weeks ago, 17 classes ago, we talked about the importance of reading scriptures, A, for study, which is the time that we pause and we take notes and we ask questions, we go back and forth and back and forth. But there's also the important times when we just read the scriptures, not stopping to say, what does this word mean and what does that word mean? And if you remember, I spoke about reading for context to see the whole storyline. And so I want to remind everyone of that challenge, because that's a really important part of getting the scriptures into us. First and foremost, just getting the words into our hearts so God can speak to us. So I wanted to remind everyone of that. I won't ask you for true confessions in terms of who's been doing it and who's not been doing it. But I will ask next week. Just wanted to welcome Broka Khan from Borko, Serbia. He was with us last week too. If you remember, he asked a question from Serbia, and also Danny and I believe Kiki Iselin from Paris, Tennessee. They've been on for a few weeks now, chatting with us back and forth. So, and last week you were on the computer, but now you're face to face. So that's an invitation to whoever's watching us on the computer. We would love to have you in person. And anyone who chooses to participate, we'll do our best to work into the conversation tonight. All right. Last bit of announcements is tonight's coffee cup. Now, this is from Bristol, England. Now, remember, we had a cup from Bristol a long time ago because we have a fan in Bristol, England. Actually, we have a couple of fans in the United Kingdom. And this says, Father Athanasios loves Bristol, England at nighttime. And it's a nighttime scene of a bridge in Bristol, England. I wonder if that bridge is for sale. And and the other cup says, Father Athanasios Heros loves Bristol, England in the daytime. So I'm using the nighttime cup this time. But I got bad news. No, I didn't break it. I'm on my last coffee cup. 17 straight Bible studies. I have not had to reuse a cup. I have had 17 unique coffee cups used for Bible study, and now I'm on my last cup, and I don't know what I'm going to do next week. Someone's going to have to... Pauline brought me a cup last week. Yeah, she brought me a cup last week. She brought me South Carolina last week. So someone is going to have to either send me a cup or I'm going to have to drink coffee out of the spout next week. And so thank you to our friends in Bristol, England, for tonight's coffee cup.
I got Mom and Pops and...
All right. Shall we start with our opening prayer? Why don't we do that? All right. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Shine within our hearts, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds that we may comprehend the message of your gospel. Instill in us also reverence for your blessed commandments, so that having conquered sinful desires, we may pursue a spiritual life, thinking and doing all those things which are pleasing to you. For you, Christ our God, are the light of our souls and bodies, and to you we give glory, together with your Father who is without beginning, and your all-holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, always, now, and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen. All right. So, I was noticing as we were starting, tell everyone back home, if you're using the Orthodox Study Bible, the new edition, and I say new, it's already 10 years old, but the Old and New Testament, we've been on the same page for 3 weeks. But there's just that much to learn from St. John Chrysostom, and we're really going to see a lot of St. Stephen's preaching tonight, and again next week. And then we will have his martyrdom we'll read about, and then there is 1 week in February. I'm going to be gone on February 18th, so we will not have Bible study on February 18th. Oh, see, you're not going to miss Bible study. So, who would like to start chapter 7, verse 6, and read the first section, just 6, 7, and 8? Who wants to start? You want to start? Is that your way of saying you want to start? No, you don't want to start? 1479, page, chapter 7, verse 6. Janelle, would you read the first few? We've got to grab the microphone here. Chapter 7, verses 6, 7, and 8. Let's start there and see where it takes us.
But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. Okay, so here there's a couple of things going on. First is we're getting a great lesson on endurance. And that's kind of where St. John Chrysostom takes the theme for this particular homily. He talks about what I've written here as the delayed fulfillment of the promise of God. Right? He promised Abraham all of this. Abraham, right, doesn't see it. We talked about Moses last week. He promised Moses. Moses doesn't see it. So there's this delayed promise. Not that God doesn't fulfill his promise. It's that there's a lesson of endurance here, to be patient, to wait for God, and to be obedient to him, right? And so, listen to I think right here, such great inspiration from Chrysostom. He says, "He the same that promised, he that gave the land, first permits the evils. So also now, though he has promised a kingdom,
Yet he suffers us to be exercised in temptations. If here the freedom was not to be till after 400 years, what wonder with regard to the kingdom? So if he had promised the Jews the promised land, and it took them 400 years before they actually are escorted into the promised land, the physical promised land, his point is, how much more great is the kingdom of heaven worth waiting for? Okay. And we can say that right now it's been basically 2015 years that we've been waiting for the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. Although we know, according to the church tradition, the kingdom of heaven is present in the church. Just as God was present with the Jews in the desert, and in this case, 400 years of slavery. Right? I mean, we're talking about some serious challenges to the Jewish people. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, but look at the other thing he says here. St. John Chrysostom says, this above all showed the riches of God's resources, that in its very reverses the nation increased, while enslaved, while evil entreated, and sought to be exterminated. And this is the greatness of the promise. For had it increased in its own land, it had not been so wonderful. Right? So think about that. That's how amazing God's promise is. If it's increasing in the midst of 400 years of slavery in Egypt, think of how great that promise really is. That enduring all of that suffering, the promise is still. So there's that longing. And it brings in this theme, right? That we need to be enduring because there's a great benefit coming. There's a great promise to be fulfilled. So if they had to wait 400 years in the desert, aren't we willing to wait for God's kingdom? But no, we want things now. We want things on our own terms. We want things when we want them, how we want them, and so forth. So this is, I think, the lesson that we can learn from this, and that becomes a little bit of a theme throughout the evening.
This 400 years begins.
You got to use the mic. Got to use the microphone. Got to use the microphone.
I'm just asking.
Well, you got to wait for the microphone. Now be patient. Be patient. Pull it all the way up to you so people can hear you.
You said 400 years, and then you mentioned 2015. We're still working on it.
Right.
That 400 years, what was the beginning of the first year of that 400?
Do you mean in a real year, in terms of like what year BC?
Well, what we're talking about now.
I don't know the actual. I mean, I could look it up real quickly. I don't know the.
Biblical text talks about Ramesses II.
Yeah, I don't know the true calendar year off the top of my head. I mean, I could look it up of when they were in Egypt, but we're talking a few thousand years ago.
Oh, I understand that, but you said 400 years.
But they were enslaved for 400 years.
Yeah, but for 400 they were enslaved, but we are talking from what is the beginning of the 2015.
Well, when I said 2015, I'm talking about since Christ. Separate from the 400. I'm just commenting that the Jews were enslaved for 400 years, waiting for the promise of God, right? And Chrysostom's point is the promise will be fulfilled. We just have to be patient for it, okay? And my point is that since Christ came, Christians have been waiting 2015 years for Christ to return.
All right.
Right? And so we can probably say, now Chrysostom doesn't go into this, but let's just acknowledge it for a moment. Just as we know that people begin to think, is Christ really going to come back? You know, and we've talked about that before. These Christians that we're talking about right here, St. Stephen, St. Peter, the actual apostles and the first hundreds of Christians, they actually believed they would live to see the return of Christ. All right. So in a way, St. Stephen, to make the connection from our tangent, St. Stephen, if they're listening to him, he's warning them, look, guys, don't think it's going to be as fast as you think it's going to be. remember this, remember that, remember the desert, remember, so he's going to go through this whole thing trying to, and one of the things that we see here is that he's so gentle. We talked about that last week, the gentleness of his message. He's not hitting them over with a club. But if they have eyes and ears to really pay attention to what St. Stephen is saying, they're being told, hey, it's not going to happen overnight. Don't get your, I don't want to say don't get your hopes up, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? So,
Last night, I watched
you got to use the microphone.
last night I saw something on television
Closer.
that I thought was, in a way, kind of, I'm thinking about it as now, HBO had a 2-hour and some minutes special on the liberation of Auschwitz.
Yeah, well, yesterday was the anniversary, right? Yeah.
And when I see the pictures they showed, the numbers that were thrown out,
Yeah.
how can blessed Lord let that evil that was there become so? I mean, the people in the villages were not like miles away,
Yeah.
like maybe a couple 100 feet.
And Peter, that is the age-old dilemma. And we've talked about it a little bit before, but all right, so God has given humanity freedom. And that freedom is so profound that he doesn't take it away from us. The only thing we can say is using St. Paul's words from Romans, his mercy is sufficient. The horrific reality of the Holocaust. And not just the Jews who were slaughtered. They slaughtered many, many people, not just Jews of the Holocaust.
1 million was slaughtered at this
But-
camp, plus 100,000 non-Jews.
Well, just at that camp. I mean, there were millions. I mean, there were Armenians that were slaughtered. There were all sorts of people who were slaughtered
Gypsies.
during the Holocaust. I mean, that was a horrific moment in human history. I'm not even going to pretend to know what goes on in God's understanding. I can only hope that it's as bad as it gets here, it's just that much better there, is what St. Paul tells us. Okay? And so, yeah, there have been some real horrific moments in human history. We're going through, I would say we're entering into another horrible time of human history where we're going to see more beheadings and slaughterings and things like that. Does that mean God is not working? God is always working. But let's look at it from the other side of the coin, which does not in any way comfort someone's pain who's experienced something like the Holocaust. But if God is going to interfere in something, where's that line going to be drawn? In other words, he's either given us freedom or he hasn't. And that's the tough thing about understanding God and his wisdom. The moment he interferes with our freedom, then where's that line going to get drawn? Sitting around this table, we might agree the line would be drawn stopping Hitler. But if the line's going to be stopping Hitler, who else is it going to stop? In other words, where God has drawn that line in the sense that he has allowed us ultimate total freedom. Once you open that door to eliminating the freedom of even one human being from, we're talking from God's vantage point. Do you see the difficulty in that question?
I do, but I also wonder is what enters man's heart? You're not talking not just one person involved. You were talking thousands of people who were part of that.
The root the root of all human sin is ego. There's nothing else. The root is ego. Whether it's financial ego, whether it's authority ego, whether it is, no matter what it is, the root of all sin is ego. Starting back from when it says in the book of Genesis, Eve, knowing she wasn't supposed to eat that tree, looks at the tree and says, "Oh, it's beautiful to look at and to contemplate." And she turns into her own ego, and from there all humanity falls from the ego. Which is why Orthodox Christianity is about defeating the ego, defeating the passions. Christ says, deny yourself. Right? The ultimate root of all sin. So what comes into someone's heart? It's themselves. And greed takes over. Ego takes over. I know better than the rest of the world. I'm going to cleanse the world, if I'm Adolf Hitler, from this race or that race or this race. It's all ego. But Hitler, I promise you, although we experience the pain and the horror of it, there's a lot of Hitlers out there who never kill a single person, but who do just as much damage to humanity than Hitler ever did. When they're leading our children into the sex drives, I mean, wherever you turn, there's people leading people down the path. So where are you gonna draw that line? You know, the church says no one is sinless. So if no one is sinless, and we've talked about before, all sin is sin, where's God going to draw that line? He'll let me do my sin, but he's not going to let you do your sin? Now, when we're seeing us versus Hitler, that might seem like an easy line to draw. But
there were so many
We read
innocent,
in the papers today.
there were so many innocent people.
Sure it was. You don't think God took care of them? Remember, from our vantage point, see, look, and this is, it doesn't soothe the pain, but from a spiritual vantage point, yes, they were gassed, yes, they died, but this life is but an instant to eternity. So even, and that's what Chrysostom said last week, right? To be afflicted is not an evil. To sin to sin is evil. So the worst thing, and St. Paul talks about this, Christ talks about, don't fear the person who can kill you, your body. That's going to return to the ground anyway. So from a spiritual vantage point, when those thousands and thousands of people are being slaughtered, okay, God is great, his mercy is wonderful. Okay. You're presuming that they themselves were sinless. They all had their own struggles. Right. So, I mean, that's why it's so easy to sit on our chair now in 2015 by our standards and say God should have done something. But then God takes away freedom, and he's not likely to do that. I challenge you, find how many cases he's taken away human freedom. Right? The great King David, he's a murderer. He lets him do it. Right? I mean, we're about to see Joseph. He lets Joseph's brothers, that's the next section. He lets Joseph's own brothers sell him into slavery.
He was testing him.
Right? No, God doesn't test in the same way that you're using the expression.
Well,
But do you see what I'm saying? I mean, God allows, we're going to see right here, they're selling their own brother into slavery.
True.
Right? And what does Joseph do? Joseph, remember we mentioned this weeks and weeks and weeks ago. In the scriptures, Joseph is a type for Christ. Meaning like a literary version of the word type, right? A type of Christ. So what does Joseph do? He's sold into slavery by his own brothers. And what does he do? He forgives them. He helps them get their things. Right? That's the challenge of the Christian life. Let's move on to the next section, 9 through 16. Who wants to read?
And the patriarchs,
Wait, you got to use the microphone. 9 through 16.
And the patriarchs moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his isles. Now there came a dearth over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no substance. But when Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And at the second time, Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, threescore and 15 souls. So Jacob went down into Egypt and died, he and our fathers, and were carried over into Cyprus, and laid in the sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Ammon, the father of Cyprus.
Okay. So now, remember, I've warned you, speaking of the Holocaust, I've warned you that St. John Chrysostom is very hard on the Jewish people. Remember, we've talked about this, I think we mentioned a couple weeks ago.
Well, you said it last.
Over the centuries, it's gone back and forth in terms of how people characterize the Jewish people. Chrysostom, by today's standards, would be considered anti-Semitic. He was not favorable to the Jews. So what I'm about to say is purely from a spiritual vantage point, not, seeing us yesterday was the Holocaust Memorial. The first point here is that if you read what St. Stephen is telling the people here, the Jews themselves were the cause of their own evils. Okay. Now, ultimately, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that in this case, the brothers sold into slavery, so there's that internal cause there. We're creating this problem for ourselves, right? We sell our brother, we do all these things. But in a grander spiritual sense, aren't we all responsible for our own struggles? I mean, ultimately, with very little exception, the Holocaust being probably one of them, right? The Jews didn't go to Hitler and say, please, they didn't, but ultimately our struggle in life is caused by us. We make poor decisions, we make this, we make that, right? We bring on our own evils. Yeah, take the microphone. Yes. Now again, that doesn't mean that there does not exist other evil being done to us. I'm not suggesting that there is not a situation of that. Don't misunderstand me. Go ahead.
Okay, that's kind of what I was going to comment on, is that the way that I say it is that sometimes when God whispers and we don't listen, that he will yell.
I like that. I like that.
So
what she said was, sometimes when God whispers and we don't hear him, then he'll yell at us so we can hear him.
So I think sometimes we can be aware, if we are aware, that we can see that and go, okay, I should have done this, I should have done that. He was trying to speak to me and this sort of thing. But I think, you have car wrecks and Holocaust and things of this sort that of course, I don't know, but I don't see a direct correlation to some things.
Totally separate. I'm not talking about those situations at all.
So I think when Peter was talking earlier is that when Scripture talks about to follow me even before your family, that I think that in talking about the ego, that a lot of times we think, we have this protection and we have this great life, and if we love Christ and he loves us, then everything's going to be just happy all the time. And that might not be what God's plan is for us. And that I think the bigger picture is, I don't know the names, but when I was reading of the saints, it really helped me. The woman who lost her 2 daughters, was it 2 daughters or 3 daughters, and she was forced to watch them die, and then she ended up dying on her own or afterwards.
Sophia, Faith, Hope, and Love.
Okay, yes. And I think it's a way, that we react. That if we fully believe and have our faith is very strong, and we really follow and love Jesus and what he has in store for us, that instead of saying, why did that happen to me, then you just say, Christ will get me through this type of thing. And it's the way that you react to what happens to you and what happens to the people that you love, and not necessarily focus on why.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing to that, or maybe I'll offer maybe a slight nuanced correction. I'm not a big fan of the term God's plan for me. God's plan for all of us is the same. Every human being, his plan for all of us is to live in communion with him. Our journey there is a synergy, a co-working between us and God. And that's where the freedom comes into play. God sends his angels, God whispers, the Holy Spirit says, hey, try this, try that. And it's up to us to listen to that advice, right? Just like I've said this before, and he doesn't, I don't think we're reading about it in tonight's situation about with King David. No, we're not. But the Jews say, what do they say? We want a king like those guys do. No, you don't. Yes, we do. No, you don't. All right, here's your king, and he's an adulterous murderer. All right, so, I mean, at some point, that's where this is coming from in terms of we bear the responsibility, is that we either ignore God's advice, or like I said on Sunday in my sermon, sometimes we're so busy with all the other commotion around us that we're not even hearing God's words. He's saying, hey, don't go over that cliff. You're going to get hurt. And we're too busy over here with our own ego to even hear God's thing. Does that mean God didn't, God let us walk over that cliff. Not that he wanted us to walk over that cliff. That's why I say it's such a fine hair. I mean, not even a hair, thinner than a hair. Where is God going to draw that line on who he stops and who he doesn't? And that's the age-old struggle with God, right? And all we can pray for is God's mercy is sufficient. His wisdom is greater than ours. He knows what he's doing, right? And as we've heard here in the past few weeks, Stephen's about to get stoned. Ultimately, so what? There's eternity waiting for him. Should God have stopped the Jews from stoning Stephen? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not willing to have that, to say he should or shouldn't have. That's what, that's what I'm kind of, So if we live to be 110 years old, 116 is the oldest person I think right now in the world, something like that. Let's say we're 100 years old, right? That's still not even a drop in the bucket of eternity. That's I think the point that Chrysostom was trying to point out here is we have to endure the struggles of life, knowing and trusting in the promise of God. And part of what St. Stephen is going to get to here when he ultimately, and next week where you see, he ultimately pushes it all the way and they stone him. Ultimately, he's setting all this up. First, he's doing, and this, like we talked about last week, he's using their own history to try and teach them what's happening, right? The delayed response, that they brought these evils on themselves. What are they doing? They killed Christ, right? And then they're going to wonder why things are happening. So he's slowly bringing them forward, right? That's that same pattern again from the book of Acts. The condescension to where the people are, to slowly lift them up, right? So he's using their own history to prepare them for what's happening, what's going to come, right? Remember last week we said the Jews were Persians, and he pointed that out to show that there's going to be other non-Jews that coming in, but this is a part of a pattern. God's going to bring in whoever he wants to bring in. If he can make Persians the people of God, why can't he make Greeks the people of God? Heaven forbid the Greeks come into the church, crazy Greeks. Greetings from, I don't know how to say this word, but Owain Abdawi. Greetings from Bryshano, Wales. So someone from Wales is on tonight. And it says here, greetings from South Carolina. So that must be someone here locally, and it's Presbytera. She's online watching on the computer. Okay. Of course, everybody can hear that at home too. So anyway, my microphone. So let's. So again, obviously he's harder on the Jews than we would expect him to be, but that was part of the era that he was living in. We just have to accept that for what it is. Now, the other point here in bringing up Saint Joseph is that the Jews had to depend on Joseph for everything. Remember, Joseph was brought in; he was trusted, just like Moses was trusted. Joseph, they have to trust him for everything. He knows what they need. He brings them in. He welcomes them. He gets them to be favored, right? Even though they sold him into slavery, right? So what St. Stephen is doing, as I mentioned, is he's teaching the resurrection figuratively using the Jewish plight, famine, enemies, destroyed by foreign kings. All of these things happened to the Jewish people, but God rescued them. Okay? Delayed as it might have been, God rescued them. So Chrysostom's pointing out that these are all ways for that St. Stephen is using to try and get people to understand the resurrection. All right. It's Chrysostom, even my word here is he humors the Jews by retelling the Jewish history and retelling of the patriarch's jealousy. Why does he bring jealousy in here? Because the Jewish council's jealous. They're jealous of the attention that the apostles are getting, right? This is an ongoing pattern for all humanity, not just for the Jewish people. All right. Oh, Wayne said, haha, nice try. I obviously did not pronounce any of that correctly from Wales, so that's okay. Let's see. Let's move on to the next section, 17 through 22. Can I read that section? Or does somebody else want to read? I'll read that section, 17 through 22. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so they might not live. At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So there's that beautiful imagery there. Remember, Joseph is a type of Christ, and Moses is a type for Christ. So when we read the Old Testament, this is the Orthodox tradition now of reading the Old Testament. When we're reading the story of Joseph, we see it as a foreshadowing image of Christ. The same thing, we see Moses. We read all the story of Moses, the whole picture, the giving of the law, the leading of the people out. You're reading all of the story of Moses with the imagery of Christ. It's just not some guy named Moses, right? It's a prototype, a type for Christ. So you've got this pattern going on. So now he's moving on to Moses. So what St. Stephen's going to do is he's drawing closer and closer to the real Jesus, till eventually he actually says this one, right? So, but we're not there yet. Okay, so next point here, there's a constant fight against the people of God, meaning that the people are always in some kind of a rebellion. But who wins? God. God always wins. Whether the Egyptians have them enslaved, whether the Turks have the church enslaved for 400 years, whatever is going on, God is always ultimately victorious. Now, it might be later, right? And that's the endurance we're supposed to learn, but God is always victorious. And I think that's where maybe our contemporary Christianity kind of falls short a little bit. We call God all-powerful, but we say that to mean, why can't he do something now? Right? And I'm not saying you were going that direction, but that's kind of the connection. God's power is displayed later, not necessarily now. Yes, he could come down with a bolt of lightning, but how often does he do that? Right? So
I'm not saying he has to come down with
right.
lightning, but what I sat watching 2.5 hours spellbound was how the hearts of men
Well, they
to evil.
absolutely.
Not
Absolutely.
just
But, and it's not just that, though. Keep in mind, and you hear this too about the so-called, I was just following orders.
Yeah.
What's the root of that excuse? Self-preservation and ego. You see what I'm saying? How the ego is really at the center of everything? If it's true, which they suggest, and I have no reason to doubt, that most of the SS people would have gladly not killed all those Jews. That's what people say these days. I have no reason to doubt that.
Well, there was
But ultimately, the reason they killed the Jews for self-preservation. You see? So their own root sin was caused by them saying, I don't want to get killed, so I'm going to kill somebody else. Self-preservation, the ego.
when I
Go ahead.
out of the thing last
I got to use the microphone, though, so people can hear you.
was when the Russians liberated Auschwitz and they went in, there was fires, furnaces,
Closer to the microphone.
crematoriums were still going. They were so revolted when they saw that, they killed all the guards. They completely.
And again, I'm in no way trying to suggest that the Jews brought the Holocaust on. I would never in a million years suggest that. I'm only addressing the other side of the coin, in that we don't fully understand how God thinks, because he's God and we're not. To quote my wife, if we understood everything about God, our heads would explode. It's that simple. We just don't understand it. We just don't understand it. Okay, moving on. St. John Chrysostom writes here, mark how it shows the truth of that saying of Gamaliel's. So, remember, what did Gamaliel say was going to happen? If you leave it to go, it's no problem. But if it's from God, you won't be able to stop it. So, even 400 years in Egypt, were the Egyptians really able to stop God? No. When something is from God, it cannot be stopped. Okay, now again, that doesn't mean in our chronological understanding of it, right? And that's where the patience comes in. But that's so Gamaliel said it, and Stephen now is saying the same things. And now we get into the really beautiful part. Every attempt to destroy God's promise is used to fulfill it. Right? In Chrysostom's own words, they were saved by the means of the very person whom they expected to be destroyed. They sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph helped them. You remember, they're the ones that shoved Moses aside. Are you going to kill us like you killed the other person? Right? So they banish Moses. It's Moses who saves them. They kill Christ. It's Christ who saves them. Right? So the very thing that they think they're trying to destroy ends up being used to fulfill the promise. God always sends help when things are at their worst. And Peter, maybe this is the real ultimate answer to your point. And he writes here, Chrysostom, he who is to be their champion is born, neither after nor before these things, but in the very midst of the storm. So, spiritually speaking, in terms of the Holocaust, that means it could have been much worse, at just the right moment in history, God sends the relief. That's what Chrysostom is trying to say here. And we see that, what does it say in Scriptures? And when the fullness of time had come, God came into the world. Now, I think I've said this before, if you see this pattern of humanity dipping down to the bowels of immorality, and then God doing something to rescue us, whether it's the flood, whether it's the Tower of Babel, whether it's the Jews from Egypt, but there's this pattern, right, in humanity. And we saw it dip when Christ came. Just using the visual, if you were to follow, if Adam and Eve is at this end, and you're seeing this pattern of humanity, and the waves are getting deeper. We fall deeper, and then we're rescued. Then we fall deeper, and then we're rescued. Then we fall deeper, and then we're rescued. If that pattern holds, and that's when you start talking about the tribulation that's coming, or whatever is coming before Christ, if God always sends his Redeemer at just the right moment, when it seems to be at its worst, said another way, it's going to get much worse before Christ returns. Think about that. That's the pattern of human history. God, how many times did you see in this pattern where God sent his Redeemer when things were wonderful? And why do you think that is? Because of the ego. Because when things are going wonderful, when you have money, when you have this, when you have that, you don't need a Savior. You can do it all yourself. That's the root of all those stories in the gospel where it was the wealthy who rejected God. It was the powerful who rejected God because they didn't need somebody to help them. So they thought. So they thought. They thought they had everything in control. But if that pattern holds through, are we in for something? Right?
The bad's going to get deeper.
Yeah. That's the pattern, isn't it, in human history?
Back up to go.
I mean, think about this. Before the flood, what does it say? Noah's family was the only righteous family left.
That's saying something.
Yeah. And what does God do? Before it's too late, he rescues humanity. Remember, it's not about the person, it's about humanity. So you never know what pattern is coming.
I think maybe people think that.
Got to use the microphone so they can hear you. Because
Noah was because he was the only good man, but it
yeah. Okay, a couple more points here. St. Chrysostom says, thus also does Christ in his death give proof of his power. Thus also does he reign as king where they sold him. So we already mentioned that. Let's read the next section, 23 through 29. Peter, can you read that section?
Now, when he was 40 years old, he came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing of one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver him by his hand, but they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to two of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are my brethren. Why do you wrong one another? But he did not get his neighbor wrong, pushed him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons.
Okay, so we already pointed that out, that they kick Moses out, and they say, when in fact he was their ruler, and he was to be that, and they kicked him out. All right, so since we already covered that, let's move on to the last section, 30 through 34 Paulie, do you want to read that section? Go grab the microphone. 30 through 34.
And when the 40 years had passed,
Closer to the microphone.
an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, have heard their groaning, and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt.
Okay. So, Chrysostom's words here just are so beautiful. He says, the greatness of his tender care. See how he shows that both by kindness and by chastisements and by miracles, God was drawing them to him, but they were still the same. That God is everywhere present, they learned. Even in the midst of their disobedience now, and they're kicking Moses out, and God never forgets. He says, I've heard them. I know their struggle. I've got a plan. Okay, and that's something that we just have to be able to trust that God has it. You know. One last point before we move on to our teaching element. Just one final reminder that time does not dilute God's promise. God makes a promise, he's going to fulfill it. So where we're stopping here now at 34, notice at 35, just as a flash forward to next week, it says, this Moses whom they rejected. And that sets in the next tone, which is why Chrysostom stops here, just as a reminder, this was an everyday thing. So we just finished now homily 16, so just over 2 weeks after Pascha. Remember, this is a daily thing now for St. John Chrysostom. So he stops there, knowing that he's going to be getting together again the very next day, but Stephen changes his tone here. And he starts getting into the rejection and what they did wrong and how they suffered and this and that. And then ultimately he says, and you guys have done the same thing. They'll throw rocks at him. Okay. Let's move now to page 103 in the homilies. Do y'all remember our friend Virginia, who used to live here? I don't want to say her last name on the internet, but Virginia, red hair. She used to anyway. She's now living in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama. So Virginia says hello. Since she wrote her name on here, I'll say it. Virginia Murdoch. Remember Virginia Murdoch? Yes. Virginia says hello. Hello, Virginia. She's an old friend of ours, now living in Alabama. Okay, so page 103. So we've got 4 points here that we want to make on spiritual endurance. Point number 1, the power of God is revealed in affliction. Look on page 103, the right-hand column, almost 2/3 of the way down. He afflicted them. Right, you see it there?
Yeah.
It was to show his power that he can do all, and not only so, but that he may also train them. A little further down. Also, it was in order that having come out of much suffering into rest, they may give thanks to God. For affliction is a great good. For hear the prophet saying, it is good for me that thou hast humbled me. That's from the book of Psalms. Okay? So the power of God is revealed in affliction. Point number 2. Nothing good is from bodily origin, but spiritual origin. We are now, page 104, second column, about halfway down. This is the greatest joy. Do you see it there? About halfway down the right column. page 104. This is the greatest joy, such as the apostles rejoiced withal, the joy of which prisons and scourges and persecutions and evil report and all painful things are the source and the root and the occasion, whence also it comes to a happy issue. This is the joy I also would have. From nothing bodily has its origin, but from spiritual things. So even in those horrible moments, there's some, that's when they said the good can come from the bad, right? That's what Chrysostom is saying. Point number 3. To go without joy here is to go without grief also. Let's see what he means by that. Almost to the bottom of page 104. To go without joy here is to be without grief also. And to be without grief here is to go without pleasure too. And in truth, these are the things which produce real joy, since the others have the name only of joy, that they altogether consist of pain. Remember, he spoke last week, maybe the week before? It's the rich who are always anxious, not the poor. Right? Was that last week we talked about that? And so in the same way, the real joy comes from not having the problems, but it also means you don't have the pleasures, so to speak, right? He's speaking now about the passion. So it's a little bit of a nuance there. So we may not be joy, but without the joy, we also have nothing to grieve about, right? Interesting point. Point number 4. The humble man lives in much enjoyment. Page 105. The humble man lives in much enjoyment, expecting honor from none. If he received honor, he is pleased. But if not, he's not grieved. That should be a bumper sticker. It's too many words for a bumper sticker. But let me just say that again. The humble man lives in much enjoyment, expecting honor from none. If he receive honor, he is pleased. But if not, he is not grieved. I mean, these little kernels of wisdom. Okay, 3 weeks on the same page in Scripture we've done now. But look at all this wealth of stuff. This week, spiritual endurance. Last week, we talked about trusting in God's promise. The week before, living with others and all of this wonderful stuff that's just pouring in. I'll tell you what, it just never ends. You ask me how, about preparing for Bible studies. Pastor Center will tell you, there's another one. I'm just like cheering out, because if I shared all the gems that are in these things, right, we'd never get through the Scriptures. That's why we're doing kind of a little bit of both, right? Because I don't want to be just the words of Chrysostom. We have the Scriptures. He's just guiding us through. But if you think, so, you have to see, where is Chrysostom coming from? So where St. Stephen is trying to tell the Jews that they have to learn endurance. And Chrysostom is saying, this is how you learn endurance, right? By embracing the affliction, knowing that the good is coming from the affliction, and knowing that the humble man, this and the other thing, so that you can patiently endure waiting for God's promise. There's a connection there for Chrysostom. It's not a random thing that he's just going to start talking about endurance in affliction. For Chrysostom, it's all interconnected, because what's the purpose of life? Getting to heaven. Preparing ourselves to live eternity with heaven. Now, page 105 and 106. I've titled this part here, our little life application, A Healthy Body Requires Labor, So with the Soul. Point number 1. If you desire a healthy soul, you will not fill it with excess. Just as the body is ruined by excess, good without physical work, so too the soul, I'm sorry, let me read that again. Just as the body is ruined by excess good without physical work, so too the soul is ruined by experiencing only blessings without suffering. Wow. Is that something or what? Point number 2. What is labor for the soul? Affliction, humility, and sacrifice. So if we're willing to put all this work into other things in life, you know, this is a routine, this is a pattern of the fathers, right? You work for something that's important for you. Well, that means you got to work your soul too, and that's our way of life. We're coming up on a season in a few weeks. Great Lent's going to begin. More chances for us to train our soul, to work our soul, to practice humility, to practice embracing and being patient through affliction. All this stuff is interconnected. So, questions? And if anybody, we have a few minutes left. We're right at 8:00, so we'll have a few more minutes if anyone asks any questions. No? Wow, I answered them all. All right.
No, we can't answer the questions, how to ask them.
Yeah. See what what y'all don't know back home is. What you all don't know back home is, as soon as I turn off the camera, they're gonna say, "Oh, but I have a question. I have a question. I have a question." So, and we're gonna be here for another half hour, and you don't get to appreciate that because you're sitting at home instead of traveling to Florence to be with us in person. Thank you. This is going to bring us to the end of our Bible study tonight. I want to thank everyone here for tolerating the cameras and the microphones and all that kind of thing so you could participate this evening. I also want to thank the Orthodox Christian Network for presenting this evening's Bible study through the internet, and all of you for participating. Looking forward to seeing you next week, where we're going to finish chapter 7. Woohoo! But until next week, God bless you, and don't forget to live a new life in Christ. Be Transfigured is a production of the Transfiguration of Our Savior Greek Orthodox Church in Florence, South Carolina, and presented by the Orthodox Christian Network. Contributions in support of this ministry may be sent to Be Transfigured, 2990 South Cashua Drive, Florence, South Carolina 29501, or online at our website at www.liveanewlifeinchrist.org.